Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. My guest today is novelist Bruce K. Berger, whose new book, Brothers Bound, tells the story of two POWs during the Vietnam War. Bruce Berger is also the author of a prize-winning book of poems about the Vietnam experience, Fragments, The Long Coming Home from Vietnam. I spoke with Bruce Berger in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Well, Bruce, it's nice to see you.
Great to see you, John.
Thank you for coming on over. We have been colleagues for decades in the sense that we both have been on the faculty for ages and ages.
Yep.
But we've not had a lot of interaction over the years. When you were at the university, were you always chairman of advertising and public relations?
No, I think I was for 5 years.
Uh-huh.
I didn't start out that way, but I did it for 5 years. Yeah.
And when did you retire?
2014, 10 years.
Oh, yes.
10 years.
There is life after retirement. It's a fact. Before you came to Alabama, I think probably before you went to graduate school, you had served in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
70, 71?
1970, yeah.
70.
I went over January and came home in end of December in 1970.
And you had had you been an English teacher before Vietnam?
No.
No. Your protagonist starts off as a high school English teacher.
Yep.
But you went, and obviously you were identified as literate and capable of writing things. And so your job became what?
I went over actually as an infantryman. I'd been trained to be an infantryman. But when I got there, they assigned me to this place I'd never heard of, the Casualty Branch, 101st Airborne Division in the northern part of South Vietnam. And there I became called the next of kin editor.
The next of kin editor.
Yep.
And your job was?
To write sympathy letters to grieving families back home to let them know when and where their soldier had died in the war. And sometimes I went out as well with the Graves Registration Unit to gather the bodies of fallen brothers and take them to the mortuary to start their long journey home.
Well, that's even worse. But I'm sure there was plenty of trauma in dealing with the deaths and writing the letters. Now, your first go at this took the shape of a volume of poetry about Vietnam.
Yes.
And this is Fragments, The Long Coming Home from Vietnam. And one of these poems is right on the mark. It is about, you in that poem deal with the very job that you had while you were there. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to read it, and then people can go find that book later.
Okay, thank you. Next of kin editor, Casualty Branch, Republic of Vietnam. He rarely sensed death's cold shadow, though surrounded by the dead, their hollow eyes tracking him, filling his head with somber taps, soulful music of their passage, our greatest heroes in Vietnam. He wrote sympathy letters to grieving families back home, confirming the deaths of their husbands or sons, fathers or brothers in the 101st Airborne Division. 266 letters into the year, he still didn't know. Was the weight of his words a brief coda for a too brief life? Too much, too little? Was it needed at all? Dear Mr. and Mrs., I regret to inform you your son, Private John, died the morning of July 19th in Trois Tien Province, Republic of Vietnam. He wrapped the basics in ceremonial ribbons, silver affirmations, golden glorifications, signifying his gift of life for others. A soldier to be proud of, his life for his country, a symbol of honor, a brave hero on duty. What more could he write without deepening their pain? He wanted them all still alive. He wrote his own death letter home, Dear Mom and Dad, trying but failing to grasp the straitjacket of emotional grief, a buzzing anger flooding the mind, a cry for salvation of numbness, a long hibernation from loud noises, others' laughter, and happy lives, the expression of false comfort, the 5 cruelest words of all, I know how you feel. He sent each letter for signature to an officer, then closed the KIA folder, knowing it was never truly closed, no expiration date on grief. Every time you think of him, he's young and smiling right back at you, your and our forever hero. Always present, though ever gone, shadows but no substance beyond sharp stabs of memory.
Well, that is exactly on target, and quite a strong poem too. Just said it anywhere. But you weren't done with that material, obviously. You have chosen now, recently, to tell that story in a long form. Brothers Bound.
Yes, sir.
A novel. It's a novel in the form of a survival memoir.
Yes.
So if a person didn't know, absolutely didn't know, that was fiction, a person might read it and think, this is a fellow who lived through these experiences and is now, as so many survival memoirs do, is now telling his story. But it's good for the reader to keep in mind that it is a novel because it's harsh. There are 2 characters at the center of the whole thing. They both have nicknames that matter. Buck is the simple one. Buck is a young white man whose real name I've even forgotten, but you remember. What is it?
Let's just call him Buck.
Buck. The other fellow has the nickname Hughes, H-U-E-S, not the H-E-W-E-S. And that has a lot of meaning in the book. You want to explain that? Why does he want to be called Hughes?
Okay. I'll go back to the Buck question first.
Okay.
Brian Charles Kinder is what.
Yes.
That's where the Buck came from.
Right.
BCK.
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 Yes.
And Hughes, yes, Hughes. Hughes was a multiracial man. He had black blood in him, brown blood, yellow blood, white blood. And he decided at an early age that he wanted to be called Hughes. He was every color, so therefore he was every man. He could represent every man because of all his shades of blood that he had inside him. So that's where his name came from.
And it's a self-appointed nickname. He's decided that's who he is.
Yes.
And then he lives basically as every man, as brother to, at least as brother to everyone. Well, these 2 fellows, they are, no surprise here, Buck is a writer of grief letters. Hughes is graves registration. And at one point, they're in a helicopter. They're going to rescue wounded soldiers. They're shut down and they're captured. At that point, from there on, they are well nigh inseparable. I don't think they live for the next 14 months more than a few yards from each other.
True. Yep, they're close.
The camp, the POW camp, this must be rooted in reality. I mean, this has to be something like the way it was. How did you come to know anything about that? You weren't captured.
I was not a POW. No.
Right.
I say that, I think, in the second line of the book. I was
Yes.
not a POW,
Yes.
but I've talked with a couple of guys that were POWs. I've read a number of things about that life. I've read a couple books that were written by POWs. And I saw when I was there, and when I went out in the field several times that I did, I saw the bamboo cage that those guys live in, the 2 characters. And it's pathetic. I mean, I can't imagine living a day in there, let alone, months and months and months. So, in the jungle and all of that, I knew some of that going over, but I did some research on that as well. So it's pretty well grounded in reality. in terms of nature and cages and the camps themselves.
They were they were a small unit in the jungle. You could hardly even call it a clearing.
Yeah.
But one of the jobs of the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, was to gather food. And that was that why they bothered to have POWs? Because it's just a bother. They could have just killed them.
Yes, they could have. And there were several locations in Vietnam where there were prisoners of war. These aren't huge camps. They're, 5 or 6 guys and somewhere lost in the jungle. And their job was to, just as it says in the book, was to gather food to feed the Viet Cong, not to feed themselves. And they didn't get much to eat at all. But that was their job, and that was a very real job for some of the POWs in Vietnam.
That, the food, they weren't actually growing anything. They were foraging. What was it they were after? What were they getting?
Okay. They did have one vegetable garden near the camp that was basically worked by the Viet Cong. They looked for one of the things that sounds awful, but was actually, I had some, manioc tree root. Manioc tree root. It's a tree and they've got roots of different sizes, but you can cut those up into pieces, you can boil some water and you can eat them. And so manioc tree root was one of the sort of key things that they could find, and they took them out periodically to this one hill where there were hundreds of manioc trees, and they dug them up. They spent the day digging them up, and they weren't easy to dig up. They were pretty well, tucked into the ground. So they would dig those. That was one of the big things they did. There were several rivers in the region, and they would catch fish, or they would trap fish in mosquito netting. They would capture fish in the river.
Yeah.
They would find wild grapes, bananas, other fruits that they would look for as well. So those were kind of the 3 major areas of food that they tried to get.
And so they spent the day, but they weren't, one of the little wrinkles early in their captivity is that they spent all day digging up the manioc roots, but they weren't allowed to bite one.
Yes.
They'd be punished if they ate any.
Mm-hmm.
I had a very practical reaction to some of that, and I thought, if I were the Viet Cong, I would want these 2 guys to be well nourished so they could work harder. But they were practically being starved to death.
Yes. Yes.
Your protagonist, really, Buck, went from 170 to 112 in pounds in the course of this terrible, terrible captivity. How was it practical or pragmatic to keep these 2 guys starving and weak when you wanted them to work hard all day? Does that something? I mean, why did that occur to me? I don't know, but
no,
it must occur to you as well.
It certainly sounds counterintuitive. It
Yes.
does. But at the same time, they were really driven by the captors by brutality and torment and punishment. So if they had died, and as the book says, there were at several places they brought in another prisoner or 2 to take their place, and if they died, they died. They go get 2 more to replace them.
There is an obscure sub-genre of American literature, 18th century American literature, called the captivity narrative. You ever heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I don't really know anything about it.
It's an Indian captivity narrative, and in Massachusetts, in really pre-revolutionary days, people would get captured by American Indians, and one woman was captured with her child. Her name was Mary Rowlandson, and there is a book which you can find anywhere. It's called the Narrative of Mary Rowlandson, and she finally got free. The Indians are depicted in the presumably true captive narrative as savages. They kill her infant, and they enslave her until she's finally free. There's no notion in that of Rousseauian noble savage or any grand alpha male in the forest. They're just awful. What struck me in this novel is how awful the Viet Cong were. And I wrote at a couple of places in the book, I said, this is sadistic. This is savage. Mm-hmm. This is the infliction of pain for its own sake. Does that seem right to you? Was I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there any? What does this mean? What should the reader take away about? I didn't find anybody in the book, any Vietnamese person in the book. Maybe a couple of old ladies mm-hmm. would stray into the novel, mm-hmm. but these were unrelentingly terrible people.
The soldiers, yeah.
Yeah.
The Vietnam people that I knew and met through the casualty branch and others, they were good people.
Yeah.
But it's the theme of evil. There is evil in people in the world, and that highlights it. Now there were some prisoner of war camps in North Vietnam where most of them whom were pilots. They'd been shot down in planes that were
yes.
flying to bomb, and those guys lived underground and were beaten regularly, given almost nothing to eat, and that seemed to be pretty much the style in that Vietnam War. Yeah, evil.
There is a particular, I mean, this is a study in cruelty, mm-hmm. this novel. There's one particular spot in the encampment called, God help us, the beatdown zone.
Beatdown ring.
Beatdown ring.
Yep.
That looks like sport rather than punishment. I mean, can you explain that? Can you describe that?
Well, they had in the area where that camp was, along the Thai border there, that was an area where the North Vietnamese, the NVA, who also sided, with the Viet Cong, were the North Vietnamese, where they came down to Thailand and they crossed into Vietnam. And when they crossed into Vietnam, they usually went to villages like this or places where they were maybe given arms that they didn't have. They were given arms, they were given supplies. They went through some sort of adaptation and training period. And during that, they would hold this beatdown ring. And so they did it to make the soldiers that participated even more nasty and cruel and killers, because they wanted them to kill the Americans. So they wouldn't do it, even in the beatdown ring. They wouldn't kill them deliberately. They would get them as close to death as they possibly could.
Yeah, I mean, that's sadistic.
Yeah.
But it's toughening, right? It's the idea is that the Vietnam soldier would become
yep.
inured to savagery, cruelty.
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
Something that I thought I was going to see in a 2024 novel was, now this is, you may not be surprised by this, or you might. I thought there would be some sort of zooming out for something of a geopolitical look. And it's in there, I'll bet it isn't 3 sentences, where Buck says something like, well, these people had been invaded and suffering for 50 years. But you do not zoom out to a broader look at this whole geopolitical thing. It really is right there.
Yeah.
You did that on purpose, of course. It's
did
a
that
choice
on purpose,
you made.
But there's that one passage I think that you're
Yeah.
referring to,
Yeah.
when they go up the hill and they overlook this former village where everything has been bombed, everything's gone, right. People are gone, the houses are gone, it's growing over. And Buck and Hughes do some reflection there about, I think what I wrote was, Buck and Hughes are thinking this. We thought we were suffering, in the camp that we're in. But our suffering was nothing compared to the mountain of pain and agony for the Vietnamese people who lived in villages and so on, and who wanted to be normal, if you will,
Yeah.
in terms of life.
Right.
That's about the only place that I kind of step back or
Right.
tried to take it a little higher.
Otherwise, the focus is very, very strictly on the two men.
That's correct.
The two men suffer. I would have given up many times but they have a couple of devices for survival. One is what they describe, what is described by Buck especially as the memory room. And then for Hughes, it's psalming. Psalmist. He's a psalmist. Both those are techniques for survival. And I'd love to, the memory room first. What is it?
Okay, the memory room, think about any great memory that you have. There's a story in there about Buck when his father taught him how to pole vault, for example,
Yeah.
okay? And the takeaway from that was never give up. So they would relive memories that would give them strength, that would make them happier, that would make them feel better, at least for a little bit. So they would revisit those memory rooms when the pain was really bad, really bad. They would go back to something good that had happened with their family, or like this guy's father, or Hughes' father, the reverend who took Hughes in after he lost his family. And you get back into those memory rooms, and memory rooms give you hope. Hope, it's the greatest gift you can receive in tough times like that. Hope for life, hope for another day, another hour even. So the memory rooms gave them, some great hope while they were there.
And they can withdraw from the present
That's right.
place
Yeah.
into another place that
Yeah.
is a pleasant place.
Yeah.
Hughes is a particular kind of religious. He is a street preacher. He is a man of faith, although it's not orthodox exactly. And he has the gift of would you say psalming? Is that a verb? To psalm. He makes up psalms based loosely on the ones we know, like the 23rd and so on.
Yep.
How does that work?
Well, this is Hughes. As I said in the book, there's a little bit of me in the Buck character.
Okay.
Hughes is based in part on a guy I knew in Vietnam who ended up dying there, actually. But he psalmed. I mean, he did that in Vietnam. And I was so close to him there. I knew him really well. And he did that. And he'd learned that, as a kid growing up. He lost his mother and sister at age 10 in a car accident. His father was killed in front of him in a back alley in Detroit when they were trying to rob him. He went to a juvenile home for a while, and then a minister took him into his family. And Hughes, got converted, if you will. He loved the Psalms, but he loved rapping music. Music in the 60s and 70s was that rapping stuff. And he did that. He did that as a way of praying. It was his form of praying.
Yes,
really.
right.
Yeah.
He more than Buck, although Buck evolves, but Hughes starts off as a person of faith. Buck moves towards it. Is this when you take the role of Buck in the world to talk about this book, do you talk about it as a book about faith?
It's that's one of the 4 themes in the book.
Okay.
Faith, I don't call it that. I call it the spirit, the human spirit. And that's the way it's treated there. Have you read works by the French author and philosopher Camus, Albert Camus?
Of course.
And he talks in there about the what's the word I'm looking for? The indomitable human spirit.
Yes.
He writes about the indomitable human spirit. And he says something like that, when the world pushes down on me, within me, something bigger, something better pushes right back. And that captures Hughes in my mind perfectly. He was a guy who went through hell with his family and living in River Rouge with the riots going on. But he never gave up. He always had a positive attitude and a very strong spirit. So the psalming is something that, yes, I heard him do, and I thought, I got to play with that a bit.
It's Old Testament rapping.
Yes, that's it. That's it.
And of course, anything that these two can do, each one for himself or each one for the two, helps
Yep.
in what's got to be the central theme of the whole business, which is survival.
Yep.
That is, you can't do anything else if you don't survive. Well, they escape. They survive in the your description of their escape and moving through the jungle. It's exhausting. I mean, it's just painful. It was almost as painful when they were seeking freedom as it was when they were in the cage.
Right.
I thought it was just fantastic. But you and Hughes, you are not Hughes, you are not Buck, but there is a mantra finally, which is 11 words long, and it is,
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
this should have been broadcast in Vietnam at the time.
Or in our world today.
Is there any religion going on among the Vietnamese?
Yes, and I don't remember what it is, but they are religious people. Yes.
Yeah.
But I can't remember it.
Maybe. Confucian, maybe?
Might be Confucian.
Some Buddhists,
Buddhism, maybe.
yeah. Looking over your career, you've had several books about advertising and public relations, and books about contemporary culture, and a volume of poems, and now a novel. You're not done. I like to ask people in this very spot, what are you working on now? What's going to be next?
I don't know. I've got 2 or 3 ideas I'm playing with. They're not about Vietnam. I'm off that topic. And I'll give you a title one. I'm not ready to talk about it yet, but one, for example, is 2046, Second Comings.
And that's an enigma, right? All right. Well, fine. I can live with it. Good.
But I haven't really I've got 2 or 3. I've got 3 ideas I'm playing with, and I'm just kind of going back and forth.
Well, when you roll along with those, let me know. Thank you. Okay. This has been a pleasure, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.